anglers, thanks for tuning in. My name's Steve Cooper. You're watching In Deep on the Delta, and today the video is going to be all about tides. We're going to cover everything you need to know to understand the tides here on the Delta, and we're also going to talk about the strategy of running the tides and why running the tides may not be the best strategy for you. We're going to get into that right now. Okay, if you've been fishing the Delta for long, you understand how important the tide is. In almost every case, the tide is the single most important factor when it comes to determining your success or your lack of success. And I can almost guarantee you that once the subject of tides comes up, you're going to hear somebody talk about how important it is for you to learn how to run the tides. Now, if you're not familiar with the term running the tides, it's simply a strategy of moving around the Delta in a logical pattern, staying ahead of the tides so that you can fish your prime spots at the prime tide. Pretty easy when it's put in those terms, but it's not an easy thing to do. It's not an easy thing to learn. The Delta is a huge body of water. It's got a lot of moving parts, and those parts are changing all the time from week to week, from tide to tide, year to year. It's a constantly changing and evolving system, so it's very difficult for most anglers to learn how to run the tides. Even elite anglers, learning to run the tide may take years. So if you're new to the Delta, or you may come down to the Delta for, let's say, 6 or 8 times a year, or maybe even you're a tournament angler coming from out of the area and you're coming down here and you only have a few days of practice, it's going to be very difficult for you to learn the tide. So today, we're not only going to discuss all the information that you're going to need to know to understand the tides, but we're also going to be discussing an alternative strategy to running the tides that may be better suited for you. We'll be dividing this video up into 2 segments. The first segment, we're going to talk about tides. The second segment, we will get into the strategy, the alternative strategy to running the tides. So let's start off with the tides, a little bit of tide talk. Let's divide the tides into 4 segments. So we'll talk about tide, we'll talk about tidal coefficients, we'll talk about current, and last but not least, we're going to talk about prime moving water, and that's the water that we're going to want to be fishing. It all ties together, but they're all different. Out of those 4 subjects, the tide, tidal coefficients, current, and prime water, we're going to separate tide and tidal coefficients, and we're going to separate current and prime water. Here's the reason. Tide and tidal coefficients are science. We know when the tide is going to start, we know when it's going to stop. The tidal coefficient is something that we also know. We know how big that tide's going to be, and we're gonna really break this down so you'll understand it. So first, tide and tidal coefficient, those are together, and then current and prime water. Current and prime water are something that is not written in stone. That's something that you're going to have to come out here and learn and get to know the Delta before you're going to find that current and where the prime water is. So that's why we're separating those two pieces of the tide. Before I get into talk about tide and tidal coefficient, I want to make sure that all of you understand that you should be checking out a tide table before you come down to the Delta. The tide table that I use is a site that's called Tides for Fishing, and I'll put the link in the description of the video, but that's Tides for Fishing. And through the Tides for Fishing site, you can go in and download an app for your phone that's called Neutide. I think it's Neutide. Now, both of these, both the app for your phone and the site, give you all the information you're going to need to come out here and know when the tide is, what the tidal coefficient is. It's going to give you moon phases. It's going to give you just a ton of information on both of those sites. The nice thing about having it on your phone, if you don't have a sophisticated piece of electronics that's going to kind of guide you around here, you can always have your phone here. But you should be checking the tides and the tidal coefficients every day. Okay, let's get into explaining the four phases of the tide, I guess we'll call it. The tide is simply what's coming in from the ocean into the river and going back out. In a 24-hour period, we have 2 tide phases. So when the tide comes in from the ocean and comes in and makes a high tide, it takes about 6 hours. Once we get to high tide and it moves out, that's another 6 hours. That's one tide. What'll happen again, day after day, year after year, tide will come in 6 hours, it'll go out for 6 hours. In every 24-hour period, we have 2 tide phases. That's pretty easy to figure out. What is really important out here is that you understand the tidal coefficient. And a tidal coefficient is how much is basically the difference between high tide and low tide, and that's going to tell you how much current you're going to have. Go to these apps and you look at the daily tides, it will give you a number of that tide. A real strong tide for the delta would be somewhere in the 90s, and a real weak tide would be somewhere in the 40s. Now, tidal coefficients are all dependent on moon phase. When you have a full moon, you're going to have a large number for the tidal coefficient, and the tide is going to be very swift, a lot of water movement. The difference between high tide and low tide will be great. During the time of month where you have maybe a quarter moon or less, you're going to have weaker tides, so the tidal coefficient may be somewhere around 40 to 50. A full moon, that tidal coefficient may go up to maybe 80 or 90. This is going to be one of the factors that you're going to look at when it comes to choosing your areas, because remember, high tide or a high tidal coefficient means we're going to have a lot of current flowing into the delta and a lot of current flowing out. Lower tides, very slow coming in, very slow going out. You've probably been out here and you've found those days where the tide goes up and it goes down, but you really don't feel the boat being pushed by a current. That's when you have those low tidal coefficients. And if you have these apps, they'll show you the tides and the tidal coefficients for every day of the year. So if you're only getting to come out here on certain days, you may be able to pick the days, maybe it's your vacation or maybe it's the weekend you're going to plan to fish. You can pick the days to come out on the delta where the tidal coefficients and the tides are right for you. Now we're going to get into the other side of the tides, and that is water flow or current and prime moving water. It's very easy to misunderstand a lot of the information when people come out from out of the area and they're not familiar with the delta and they hear, you got to fish the tide, you got to fish the tide, you got to fish the tide. You have to be aware of the tide, but big Florida strain bass don't like current, they don't like to be in the tide. They're not out in the middle of the river. They're usually along the banks, and there's a reason for this. And this is a little bit of science that I'll just bring in, and it's going to be real quick. In any river system, out in the middle of the river, the water is going to run faster than it does on the sides. It's also going to run faster on the surface than it does on the bottom. And that's because when water is coming down a river and along the bank it's hitting tules and rocks and docks and whatever it is, anything on that bank is slowing down the current. That's why the sides of the river are going to run slower than the middle of the river. It's also true on the bottom, as that current goes down along the bottom and it's catching rocks and things along the bottom, it slows it down. If you can think of the water coming down a stainless steel pipe, if it's just a straight stainless steel pipe, that water is going to shoot down the pipe. The minute you start putting corrugation in there, it's going to slow the current down. Same thing on the delta, except that corrugation is tules or rocks or docks. So that's something to always be aware of, because as we get into the practical side of what we're talking about, and it'll help you to choose what bank you want to fish during what period of tide that you're fishing. So keep that in mind. So we know that largemouth bass don't necessarily like to stay in strong current or moving water. That's where local knowledge comes in, and this is where you're going to have to spend some time on the river, because once you find the areas that you're going to fish, you're going to find that there may be areas that have a real strong current, there may be a seam, then there may be some moving water in there, and in that moving water somewhere is going to be prime moving water, and that's what we're looking for. So We always want to look for current, but we don't necessarily want to fish in the current. We want to find where that current is breaking. Maybe it's on a point, maybe it's behind a tule berm or whatever. That's where the fish are going to hold most of the time. There will be a few largemouth bass that are going to come out into the current and maybe pick off some bait if there's enough bait out there where they can move in real quick, grab a bite to eat and move back out. But most of the time, especially these big Florida strain largemouth bass, they're going to be back in the tules. They're going to be ambush feeding, and they don't like to sit out there in the current. So we'll pack it up real quick and we'll go out to a bank and we'll talk about the practical side of what we've been talking about when it comes to the tides and the tidal coefficients. Let's start talking about the practical application that you can use when it comes to learning about the tides and the coefficients and everything that we've talked about in that first segment. So we're out fishing now. We've left the dock and we've done our homework. We know what tide we're going to be fishing, and we know what the tidal coefficient is going to be. So we pull up on our first spot, and this is a spot that you guys may have already fished. You know the area, you know there's fish in here. So we want to be here maybe at the prime tide, which may be right at the high outgoing tide, the first couple hours of that tide. So now that we've looked at our tides for us fishing or whatever tide chart, we know we should be here at a certain time, and we're going to be fishing a high outgoing tide with a high tidal coefficient, meaning that we're going to have a tide that really rips through here. Now, to oversimplify this, I'm using a bank that just has rock and tule on it. This is just for demonstrating. Go to your spot, and if your spot has rock and tule and dock and a point and any other man-made structure or pilings, whatever it is, this philosophy will carry over into your area. But let's talk about, in practical terms, what we should be looking at when we pull up on our spot and we know we're fishing a high outgoing tide that's going to be ripping. When we get up here, knowing largemouth bass, and especially Florida strain, they don't like that ripping tide. So where are we going to start? We're probably going to start today, because the tide's ripping, in the tules. Where are the fish going to be? They're going to be nosed in the tules. They're going to be in behind the little tule clumps. Whatever can break that tide. Remember, we talked about how the tide moves faster out in the channel and slower along the banks because we have different structures that are slowing down the tide. Well, in this situation, the tules are what's going to slow down the tide, and that's why when we come here, we may be when that tide's ripping, we may not want to start up on the point where the rock is and fish all the way down to the tules. We want to come directly to the tules or whatever's breaking the tide and put your time in there first. Getting in there, maybe punching, throwing worms, creature baits, pitching in there, and getting your baits in out of the current. That's when the tide's really ripping. Now, what happens if you come out here and you don't hit the tide and it's a very low tidal coefficient and the tide is moving much slower? We may want to start on the rock during that particular time of the tide. Why? Because the fish are not going to have to fight the current to stay out on the rock. And we all know about rocks. There's always a trough, or hopefully where you're fishing, there's probably a trough between the bank out about 10 feet or 6 feet, whatever it is, to where the hydrilla or gyrodentia is, whatever weed growth you're fishing is out there, and there's a trough. Now, at times of low tide velocity, the fish are going to come out of the tules and they're going to move down that trough up and down, looking for either crayfish or sunfish or whatever type of bait may be in there. So if you come out here on a low tide, or on a tide that's not really moving, you may want to start on the rock and running those troughs, seeing if you can intercept some of those fish that are moving up and down the trough. Very simple. That's oversimplified. Big tides, get into areas that are going to protect the fish from the tide. When you have a lower tidal coefficient, maybe fish the areas of bank that just have rock or nothing to break the current. So using that, you can come out on your very next trip and start thinking about that, doing a little homework the night before, knowing what time the tides are going to be moving and how big the tides are, and you can start not running the tides, but you're going to start understanding the tides, and you'll start to see patterns when you have these big hanging tides that are running through, full moon, high tidal coefficient. You're going to find a lot of fish around structure and in behind structure. Quarter moon or less, low tidal coefficients, and the tide's not really moving, you're going to find a lot more fish on the rock bank, in the troughs, and things. Okay, now that we've talked about the practical side of looking at tide charts and taking into consideration the times of the tide and the tidal coefficients, we're going to move on and we're going to talk about an alternative strategy to running the delta. And this strategy is going to give you information on how to build up your knowledge little by little so that you can put smaller pieces of the puzzle together and build on these smaller pieces one by one to get you moving in the right direction so that down the road you are going to be able to run the tides and run the tides efficiently and successfully. So when you first come out to the delta, you're going to notice there's about 1,200 miles of waterway, and it can be very, very intimidating trying to learn this or thinking that you're going to learn it in one day or a couple of weeks or whatever. It's going to take a while. So what I suggest is breaking this huge piece of water down into small sections, and we're going to call those sections neighborhoods. And you're going to learn one neighborhood at a time. So once you've been out here for a while and you have a few neighborhoods, then you're going to be able to start moving around and really see how the tide affects each one of those neighborhoods. Now the neighborhoods should be small sections, maybe let's just say a quarter-mile area, maybe even compressed down into 300 or 400 yards. When you're finding your neighborhoods and looking for new neighborhoods, you should probably start nearest the ramp that you usually fish out of. That way they're close and you can get to them and fish them in a reasonable amount of time. Now once you learn one little neighborhood, when you start to know that area and you want to find another neighborhood, I suggest not expanding on the neighborhood. I would suggest finding a neighborhood that is down the river one way or another. Make it a couple of miles and learn. Let's just say if you start at the head of the channel and you have a neighborhood at the head of the channel and that you know, you're going to move to your next neighborhood is going to be 2-3 miles down the channel and learn that small section so that you're not just expanding one neighborhood, you're finding new neighborhoods up and down the river. So that's really important to keep in mind. When you are looking for a new neighborhood, you should be looking at a place that has as much structure as you can find in a small area. For instance, the area that we're in, we have some rock bank, we have tules, we have islands, we have some flats off of the islands, we have a point that's over on the main channel. As you can see, we've got docks and houseboats and boat ramps and everything. There's wood banks, there's mud banks, there's everything in this small little area that may only be, let's say, a quarter of a mile. You can spend a lot of time in this area just learning the little nuances of everything in this little neighborhood. We'll say there's a lot of doors to knock on, and the tules may be one door, and the houseboats or the docks may be another door, and the flats or the islands may be another door. And when you're working around here, you're going to be knocking on a lot of little doors, because what you're going to find is you're going to start seeing patterns that maybe on a day where you have lots of tide flow and high tidal coefficient, you may really find one little area back in these docks that's really good. And you may find that on a low tidal coefficient, that area that's really good at when the tide's really moving may not be that good. But just across the way, there's a little tule bank that you seem to catch more fish on when the tide's not moving as quick. You may also find areas that fish much better on an incoming tide. Other areas will fish better on an outgoing tide. So you really kind of have to think about, when you're out here fishing, every time you catch a fish, you want to make a mental note of that, and you want to make sure you think about a couple of things when you're making that note. Obviously what you caught the fish on, but think about what the tide was doing. Was it an incoming tide or an outcoming tide, and was the tide really swift, or was it just a tide that's barely moving? And when you start putting all that information together, and you know your small neighborhood, you're going to know not only that you can come to your neighborhood, but depending on the tide, you know what door to start knocking on first. Big tide, I want to go right there. No tide or low tide or high tide, I want to be out on the flats. Remember, you're not running the tide at that point, but you really are running the tide. You're just running it in a very small neighborhood. And remember, we talked about figuring out neighborhoods that are not next to each other or just expanding one neighborhood. There's a neighborhood here, neighborhood down the channel, neighborhood here. As you continue building those neighborhoods, you'll be able to move from area to area out of the location and actually start running the tides. Now that's going to take a long time, but at least you have a plan in place and you're being logical. And every time you come out here, you should be thinking, well, you know what? I learned a little bit. I learned that this area that I'm in now, when at this tide, I want to be here. Whatever it is, keep putting these pieces of the puzzle together on every trip. It will take you a while, so don't worry about learning everything in one bite, but gradually you're going to become more and more efficient, and your catches are going to go up, 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 and up. So that may be a little oversimplified for the strategy, but that's how you would do it in a nutshell. Sounds simple, guys? It's not. It takes a while to learn this whole thing. But by using the strategy that we kind of laid out, breaking it down into small pieces, you can always learn the small pieces. Now, when you come out here and maybe you haven't fished out here for a while, but you have 2 or 3 of those little neighborhoods that you have, you can always go to those neighborhoods, and you're going to know those neighborhoods a lot better than the rest of the river. So you really have to put time in on these little spots at different tides, different days, incoming tides, outgoing tides, high tidal coefficients, low tidal coefficients. You really have to work these spots, but it's a lot easier when you break them down into your little neighborhoods. Okay, with that, guys, man, I hope you got something out of that. It's been so difficult for me to do this video because there's so much information. It's hard to compress it into a small piece of video or whatever. So take what you can use and build on that, and let me know how it's working for you. Thank you guys for watching. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe, and we'll be out with another video. And God, if I figure out how to explain this a little better, maybe we'll do another video on tides. But thank you guys for watching. We'll see you at the next video.